Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. There's a lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you. I know that life outside is so hard. There's a lot of things that can tear you apart. I know the roads sometimes feel lonely, but remember you're not the one and only. There's always someone there to help you, a helping hand to pull you through. There's only one thing you should do: take my hand and join the Love and Laugh crew. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then that love and life guide you.
Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world, and welcome to tonight's live stream. Yes, Elizabeth, that's the theme song that I always play with the live stream. You must be new. It's a lovely little ditty, and it gives time for people to actually come in and join the live stream. But we're live now. Okay, tonight we have Chris Hatting joining us. Now, Chris is a very interesting fellow. He did his master's in philosophy, and in 2015 he founded an organization called South African Libertarian and changed that to Rational Standard. And in 2016, that's when he changed the name. Came about particularly in response to the media's infatuation with the fees must fall terrorists. And as a result of that, Chris published a book in the beginning of 2017. And a little bit of background to Chris: he's a student of objectivism, a passionate advocate for free markets and free minds, which is very important in this day and age, isn't it, with what's going on around the world, and in particular South Africa. Chris holds a Master's of Philosophy degree from Stellenbosch University. Right, without any further ado, let me get Chris online so we can start the conversation. Here we go. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Scott. How are you?
Excellent. Yourself? Excellent. And yourself? Can you hear me, Chris?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Okay, cool. Okay. Now, let's start off with a bit of your background. You're growing up in South Africa, your childhood, and how things have changed. And perhaps you can lead us into how you got involved in philosophy.
I guess I would start by saying, for anyone growing up in South Africa, it's an interesting place. I don't think anyone can deny that. We have such a wide range of experiences in this country. It's such a unique place in which to live. I grew up in a middle-class family in Johannesburg. I was born in 1991, lived in Johannesburg most of my young life, and then I went off to university at Rhodes University in the Eastern Cape. Had a great time there, as I'm sure anyone who knows about Rhodes would attest to. It's one of those universities, and that's where I first encountered philosophy. I was going to study law, legal theory. I ended up taking a few courses in philosophy, and the philosophy bug bit, if we can call it that. I very much enjoyed the appeal of analyzing things, thinking about things, trying to put yourself in different argumentation positions, trying to interrogate evidence, that sort of thing. Maybe in a way it's almost like applying the scientific method to argumentation. So that really appealed to me. Then in my second year of university, I encountered the work of Ayn Rand, and her books, Atlas Shrugged especially, and The Fountainhead, they hooked me quite quickly. I started reading up about that avenue of philosophy, objectivism. I started studying up about different theories of liberty and the importance of liberty and freedom for prosperity for people all around the world. That really pulled me in. And then from there, I guess, either depending on one's view, things went downhill or things went up, went very well. That's been my whole sort of career so far, is working in the liberty field, the liberty area, trying to advocate for liberty, analyzing policies, trying to write about things and talk about things from the philosophical liberty perspective.
Right. Now, tell us about Rational Standard. What exactly is it? What is its objectives?
So Rational Standard is an online publication. They are quite new. They sort of started. I became involved later on, but they started in response to the Fees Must Fall movement. I'm sure many of you, the people watching and people listening, would have heard about the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa. It was sort of this broad push by students and some people in academia to bring about free tertiary education in South Africa. Which was sort of a doomed project from the start. There's no such thing as a free lunch, so that was never going to happen. And it was also motivated by decolonization of education, that whole sort of line of thinking that anything, Western, whatever you want to call that label, was immoral and evil, and that all needed to be removed from academia. As far as I can remember, that sort of reached its apex in the year of 2016, just after I'd left university, so I was quite lucky that I wasn't caught up in all the politics of Fees Must Fall at that time. So Rational Standard was founded pretty much in response to that, in trying to encourage a different line of discourse, very much in line of sort of classical liberalism, individual liberty, fiscal responsibility, individual freedom, that sort of thing, making those sorts of arguments. Rational Standard publishes many articles weekly, trying to influence the narrative in South Africa towards a more pro-liberty approach. It's sort of a pushback against the recent push on social media by many people we would consider perhaps more on the left of the political spectrum, who push for the nationalization of all things, including education. So I think broadly that's how I describe what Rational Standard tries to achieve. They also publish one or two publications. especially around fees must fall. I think there might be the digital versions available on the Rational Standard website, but I'm not too sure about that. But I would encourage everyone watching and listening to go and check out the Rational Standard.
Right. Now, you wrote a book about fees must fall, didn't you? What's it called?
So I didn't contribute directly to that book. That was before my time when I got involved at Rational Standard. But I can very much encourage everyone to go and read that, of course. It's a collection of essays and analyses about fees must fall. It's got a wide range of voices.
That's better with that light.
Okay, was that a bit better?
Yeah, much better, yeah. Okay.
Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, it's a collection of essays. I think it's got different views of different sort of analyses. So some of them are more analytical, some of them are more data-driven, some of them are more, maybe philosophical, maybe a bit more abstract. But all of those sorts of avenues are sort of covered. I think everyone would enjoy reading that sort of thing. I can give the title. It's called Fallism, 1 Year of Rational Commentary.
Right. Okay. Now, when we talk about fees must fall, I always think of the EFF and the PLF, the radical political parties in South Africa, because they're the ones who are really pushing for that, weren't they?
Yes, correct. And it's interesting, that I think you're exactly right to highlight that. The EFF, known as the Economic Freedom Fighters, they seem to have a very different understanding of what economic freedom is. I think we should instead call them the anti-economic freedom fighters. It's sort of, they're like firefighters who are pro-fires. They have a very different conception of what economic freedom is. They very much see the state as having a central role in everything in society, in every part of our lives, especially education. And themselves and BLF very much push for the government and the state to be in control of all forms of education, which is a terrifying thought. I mean, let's assume any political party gets that sort of power. It's a scary thing. You as a parent, you don't want kids to be influenced by the state. You see your own responsibility as helping your kids' education, forming their view of the world, helping them find their way. That shouldn't be a job just left to the state. So it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the role that the state should play in education.
Yeah. Well, the really frightening thing is that the EFF are trying to set up branches all over Africa. They've got them in Nigeria, they've got the EFF in Namibia, they've got it in Zimbabwe. You hear me, Chris? I think.
Yeah, sorry, I heard the last part there. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you were asking a question. I know you were mentioning about a branch in Zimbabwe and in South Africa.
Yeah, the EFF. What I was saying is the really frightening thing is the EFF appear to have branches all over Africa, like Namibia, Zimbabwe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they sort of see themselves as maybe a new iteration or version of the Comintern, the Communist International. Of course, they style themselves as socialists and communists, and that's part of their agenda, I suppose, would be sort of world influence and pushing the world in a different direction. And of course, they'd like to focus on Africa first. They seem to adopt a philosophy that thinks that African people can only ever be socialist, that they always need the state to do things for them, which I think is a deeply paternalistic and infantilizing view of humans, of human agency, to think that people can only do anything if the state does it for them, to me is deeply problematic. And I think you're right to point out that they probably try and influence things all around sub-Saharan Africa, and they probably would go even further if they got the financial support.
Right. Now, talking about politics, what do we have in South Africa? Because I don't think it is a democracy. What would you call it?
So I suppose it's a mixed economy, as many economies are around the world. It's a mixture of freedom and state control, a mixture of socialism and capitalism. There's no what I would consider a properly free market anywhere in the world. Every country is mixed, even the United States, which one would have held up as the beacon of freedom and liberty and capitalism before, but it's become very much mixed there as well. South Africa, of course, the majority political party is the African National Congress. They've kept up their majority for the last, since the start of democracy in South Africa in 1994. They have been losing support over the years. I think that's due to a whole range of factors, their own internal squabbling and problems, their own issues with differences in ideology and implementation. Some people within the ANC are much more hardcore left-wing, and others think that maybe they shouldn't follow that sort of line. Then you have the Democratic Alliance, the official opposition. They've done intermittently well and badly in some elections. They've sort of been going up and down. I think that's a result of mixed messaging and just not being consistent with one's principles. It seems sometimes they want to play to the sort of populist rhetoric of appealing to populism, of trying to say we also support what the ANC says, but maybe not in such obvious ways. So that inconsistency has hurt them a lot, I think, in elections, both local and national. Then you have the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, who quite recently formed, and they've been doing pretty well. I suppose if one if one was being objective and had to give them credit, they've seen a gap. They are, of course, led by Julius Malema, who was an ANC Youth League leader and member, and then he left the ANC in a big blaze a few years ago, so he started his own political party. And the EFF, they seem to be doing okay. They're much more hardcore left-wing than the ANC, than the majority of the ANC, and they seem to be pushing the ANC in that direction. For example, on the Fees Must Fall story, also on expropriation of property without compensation, they've been pushing that very hard, and it seems they've influenced the ANC to also support that now, so that's very worrying. And then you have a mixture of smaller political parties all around the country. You have a few secession movements in the Western Cape, for example, in Cape Town, who want to secede from the Republic of South Africa. I don't think that would ever happen. I don't know if that's realistic, but you have that sort of plurality of voices. So we're lucky in that regard that we have many political parties to choose from. There's also the Freedom Front Plus. It's a more Afrikaans and conservative political party, and they seem to be doing a bit better lately than they have been in a while. A lot of it is also just due to the ANC's inability to deliver basic goods and services, basic infrastructure to the people of the country, and they seem to be turning away from the ANC in some ways. It remains to be seen whether they'll ever drop below the 50% that they've always had since 1994. I'm not sure whether that'll happen. But yeah, there's an interesting mixture of political parties. I wouldn't say there's any serious sort of right-wing party in South Africa. Most of them are sort of centre-left, sort of pragmatic, I suppose. So we don't really have a strong conservative party, except maybe the African Christian Democratic Party, the ACDP. They are, I guess, what I would consider the most conservative of all the parties in the country.
Right, well, I have to tell you, on this channel we consider the EFF like children, and we suggest that they wear red overalls because that hides the nappies that they're wearing. And what I'd like to ask you is, where do you see South Africa in 10 years' time?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? If I could answer that, maybe I should go into scenario planning and advising on investments and that sort of thing. It's interesting with this coronavirus pandemic. We see the government very much clamping down on civil liberties and that sort of thing, and I think they might use it as an excuse to become even more authoritarian in the future. We have seen the biggest deployment of the South African National Defence Force, the highest number of personnel in the history of the country in response to the coronavirus pandemic. So that's very worrying in terms of freedom going forward. In 10 years' time, I think South Africa could very well be in a much worse position, especially if some of the suggested policies are enacted. For example, expropriation of property without compensation, the national health insurance. There's also talking about seizing people's pension funds to fund more government projects and plans, and that's deeply, deeply worrying to think that what people have saved for and built up over decades might just be seized by the government for some of their plans that they have in mind. So I think if South Africa goes down the route of more socialist policies, we will very much end up like our neighbors to the north in Zimbabwe, like people are now in Venezuela and North Korea. That's obviously a very sad thing to think about. I think many South Africans are trying in different ways to get out of the country, trying to get some of their money out, at least, into offshore investments, that sort of thing. There's more talk about gold and silver and Bitcoin, just to sort of try and future-proof yourself. These are very uncertain times, unfortunately, for South Africans. And I think there is an opportunity, of course, to do the right things, to use the right policies, to adopt individual freedom and liberty for the country to go in the right direction. But I worry that the populism and the sort of collectivist thinking in the country might simply lead us down that sort of path to ruin.
So you're talking about going down the same path as Zimbabwe. Now, there's a very important group in South Africa who are based largely in the Western Cape. And you've got parties like Cape Exit, and you've got obviously the ULA, which is run by Hein Marx, which are looking to secede a large portion of the Western Cape and going right up actually to the Northern Cape, and create a separate state. Now, what do you think the chances of that actually happening are if things really go pear-shaped in South Africa?
So I think the biggest thing, of course, would be to look at the sort of viability of if that sort of secession movement could survive in the long run, and if they do the proper planning and that sort of thing, that could well happen. It's interesting, the inability of the ANC to govern might well help those sorts of movements, because if they gain traction and they gain control in one or two areas, and they provide good services and good infrastructure to all the people there, and they run things well in a transparent manner, people might sort of see more of a case for a secession movement. And in that regard, again, I say the ANC, through their own corruption and inefficiency, they might be helping these sorts of movements. Of course, they wouldn't want that sort of thing, but through their own ineptitude and problems, they could be encouraging these sorts of things. The future of politics and societies is always shifting. Maybe in places around the world, we see a stronger push for secession, especially in Spain, in the UK, in other places, maybe even Ireland and Scotland. So, it could happen in South Africa, and perhaps not, even in KZN. Under the Zulu Kingdom, I know that some people there aren't always happy with the decisions taken by the ANC government, so maybe KwaZulu-Natal could also do its own thing. These possibilities exist, and whether they happen or not, I think depends on a wide range of factors. But I think they definitely could happen if the current government keeps on sort of collapsing in on itself.
Right. Well, I always use Orania as the canary in the gold mine, because Orania is a beautiful little town. None of the ANC are involved in running the town, and it's got no debt. It actually generates its own electricity. It has its own water. It looks after its people. There's not one other town, city, or municipality in South Africa that is like that. And the difference is that they run by the ANC, and in some cases the DA, and they've just completely let them run down to crap. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, the suggestion the suggestion that Orania is like a shining example of what could happen if the Western Cape seceded.
I think it's a sort of it can be used as a very strong argument for that sort of thing. If you very strongly value community and self-sufficiency and that sort of thing, it's a good case study of how that sort of thing can happen. You sort of see how they've implemented things, how they've tried to work things, and that if you do things properly, if you do things right in a certain way, if you try and run things openly and transparently and have clear goals and that sort of thing, it might well work. I know for other people, maybe they prefer living in more cosmopolitan cities and that sort of thing, so it might not be something that they value, perhaps things just get to that point where we don't have a choice. We just have to go and live in smaller communities and towns out of the big cities, depending on how well or how badly things go. But I think Orania and the people there, maybe for a lot of them, they simply want to look after themselves and their families. They want to take care of themselves. They want to try and work hard. They want to try and contribute. And if anyone, I think, wants to sort of live in their own community or that sort of thing, that should very much be allowed and encouraged if that's the sort of thing that they want to do. I don't think any of us or anyone in any government should have the power to sort of prevent people from doing that sort of thing. If we truly respect the plurality of views, of opinions, of lifestyles, then that sort of thing is simply what's going to happen.
Okay, now one of your hot topics is ethics. That's one of the areas that you really concentrate on. What do you think of the ethics of the current ANC government when it comes to running every single level of government, when it comes to their mates, their cadres, their families, well, over to you. What do you think of the ethical situation?
I don't think one can use the word ethics when it comes to central government. It's two contradicting and opposing ideas. I mean, the ANC, of course, they're very strongly founded in. They're founded in the Marxist-Leninist way of thinking of the state and the government being all controlling, all encompassing. It has to have its tentacles in every part of our lives, economics, society, community, sport, whatever. Take your pick. The government has to be involved, and they've implemented that since they started ruling in 1994. They've systematically taken over every part of South Africans' lives, and we see the effects of that in very bad ways all around us, in the economic decay and the societal decay. I think that sort of central planning view of society has very strongly negatively affected all South Africans' lives, black and white, rich and poor. It's driven many richer people out of the country, a lot of capital. It's made the currency a lot weaker, so poorer people can't buy food and as much food and that sort of thing as they used to. So it has a very negative effect on everyone. I think the question of corruption and cadres and connections, that sort of thing, I think in any socialist or communist society, the bigger the government becomes, the higher the chances are for corruption. So the more you increase that sort of control and the more wealth the state has at its disposal to seize from the private sector, the more you increase the chances of corruption. I think state capture that happened under under and through former President Jacob Zuma, that was inevitable that it was going to happen in a sort of socialist society or country that such as the ANC has put into place. When you have smaller government, limited government, there is much higher chance that people are accountable to their, to the citizens, to those that elect them. They don't feel like they're sort of the kings above the normal citizens. They see themselves as the servants of the people and as public servants, not as kings and queens. So it was inevitable to me that sort of thing was going to happen, with the view that the ANC has of what they should do for people, and how they should run society. I think if we ever get back to a proper governance model, it has to require individual responsibility, individual agency, individual accountability. When you don't see yourself as having sort of responsibility for your actions and that sort of thing, I think there's a fundamental breakdown in ethics, and we won't see any sort of accountability for as long as the socialist view of government and of society is in place.
Right. Now, you touched on one of the areas that I have a particular interest in, and that's the affirmative action side of things in South Africa. Black economic empowerment, which I believe is completely destroying the country. And it's not broad-based black economic empowerment like they're claiming as one of their affirmative action policies. What it's doing is clearly just enriching a very select few people at the top, and the rest of the community, and I'm talking the white and the colored and the Indian and the African community, are just being pushed into greater and greater poverty. What do you feel about these affirmative action policies that the ANC government have brought in?
What's interesting, some of the justification that they've used in the past is that it's done to further the interests of, for example, black people in the country. But in the meantime, as you very correctly point out, they've simply made it more difficult for the average black South African to sort of improve their lives. Only those who have the right political connections get anything out of it. The companies, the big companies that have the right connections, they see themselves growing and increasing their wealth, but there's no more opportunity and scope for the man on the street to sort of improve himself. I think any policy that has as at its base sees people as mere parts of a particular race or a collective or a group as only having meaning if they're of a particular race, it's always going to result in problems. It's always going to result in immoral outcomes. You need to treat people and see them as individuals. You need to understand that with freedom comes responsibility. With freedom comes the possibility that people can fail, but they can also very much succeed for themselves and for their families. And that's a risk you have to take. If you're serious about democracy, if you're serious about individual freedom, you have to allow that sort of thing to happen. And for that to happen, you need to understand that you need a society based on merit. You need to allow people to stand and fall on their own 2 feet. Of course, the state can help those who truly can't help themselves. It can do vouchers, it can do that, any of that sort of thing. If the state wants to do some sort of safety net, it can very much identify those who truly need it based on need, not by the virtue of the color of their skin, which is a mere accident of birth. We wouldn't think we would assign worth to anyone, individual worth, whether they're black or white or yellow or pink or whatever. What happened to seeing people as true individuals and seeing that they have it within themselves to succeed? It's a very, BE and affirmative action is to me a very demoralizing and dehumanizing way of viewing people and people's agency. It very much assumes that if you're a particular race, you can only succeed because the government helps you. And it also assumes that some people are successful because they've taken from others, which to me is a fundamental misunderstanding of how wealth is created and how sort of income is generated. You become successful and wealthy by offering goods and services to people and trading with them. If someone does that in a good way, in a moral way, they should become successful and wealthy, and to me that's a good thing. So I'm diametrically opposed to any of those sorts of policies. I think they're immoral from their very conception, and I think again they simply place too much control and power in the hands of the state. And then, to reiterate what you said, Scott, we just see that those with the right connections use those connections for themselves to the cost of everyone else.
Okay, now you mentioned the word freedom a few times when you were answering that question. And don't you think that black economic empowerment is the antithesis to freedom? Because it basically shuts out the white population from gaining employment.
Mm-hmm. No, it's sort of a gatekeeping way, and again, it presumes that the government's role is to provide jobs, give jobs, that sort of thing, which is a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of government. The government should leave the private sector alone to do its thing, to create jobs. We have over 10 million unemployed people in South Africa, probably more than that now with the coronavirus pandemic, in a country of 60 million. Yeah, it might even be near 20 million unemployed at this point, and it's simply unsustainable. We also have many fewer taxpayers in the country, so it's sort of the tax base is shrinking, and the government just plans on spending more and more and more. But again, to go back to your point, yeah, any of those sorts of policies act as serious inhibitors of freedom. And it's also, it doesn't give people any incentive to grow businesses, to create more, to invest in the country. It sort of says, if you are successful or anything like that, if you don't adhere to these arbitrary criteria, we're going to punish you and your business. So why would anyone want to invest in a country like that? Why would anyone want to grow a business in a country like that, where people are just focused on an accident of birth, on the color of one's skin, where they don't want to succeed and grow businesses and grow wealth and that kind of thing? It's a very big problem in South Africa, and I think it inhibits a lot of potential for people of all races.
And that extends right across into a whole range of areas, like the funding that the ANC is saying they're going to provide business. Now, they have made it, well, especially in tourism, where unless you have a black-owned business, you get nothing. And of course,
Yes.
tourism is the most badly hit industry of the lot. And that's clearly a racist policy. It is destroying the tax base of South Africa, because the white population actually do provide the taxes. Do you think that these guys running South Africa are just complete idiots? I mean, don't they understand what they're doing to their own tax base?
I think they might understand that, but they also, I mean, with a lot of governments in Africa, throughout the last 100 years maybe, they do very well as liberation movements, but they don't do well as actual governance, parties, because they simply don't understand the proper role of what a government should be. They think individual liberty and freedom is something that sort of nice to have every now and then, but that the government should tell us how to live and how to act. I think the ANC, they're simply what's the word? They're caught up in their own ideology. They've punted the fact for years that socialism is the way, that the government needs to control everything, that this will lead South Africa to success and it will, take us to a better South Africa kind of thing. And now it's all falling apart. South African Airways is probably going to be liquidated, if not just wound down in the next week or even month. South African Airways is completely done. Eskom, I'm sure everyone knows about Eskom, the South Africa's electricity supply, and what a mess that's in. So it all shows, the ANC's view of full socialism is inherently flawed and can't work and is immoral. But they're simply, stuck to it. Maybe they think they can keep going the way that they do. I think with any dictatorial, authoritarian society, usually the leaders, they still manage to have some wealth and that sort of thing. They go to other countries for their healthcare, that kind of thing. With Robert Mugabe, the former dictator of Zimbabwe, he went to Singapore and other countries to get his healthcare. He didn't get that in the country, in Zimbabwe, in the country whose healthcare system he destroyed. So these leaders and autocrats, they destroy their country's economies through socialist policies, but they themselves don't have to suffer for that. For the poor white and black and Indian colored South African, they have nowhere else to go. The country is being systematically destroyed, service provision, all that sort of thing. But they have to remain in the country. And then for those who have enough wealth, the politically connected, they can simply go to other countries for their needs.
Right. Now, you mentioned autocratic and a couple of other words that suggest that it's not a democracy in South Africa. Is that how you see South Africa today?
Well, I guess it's, we still have free and fair elections. Every 4 years we can vote in national elections and in provincial elections. So, there is maybe a veneer of democracy, but, when you... And I use this coronavirus pandemic as the sort of clearest example. If anyone questions the government's policy, it's very much... it's dismissed quite harshly. There's laws against fake news and that sort of thing. I mean, who is the government? Who is any government to decide what is fake news? That should be up to people to decide for themselves. To think that the government can have these standards to say, no, what that person is saying on Facebook is fake news and what the other person is saying is true is very scary territory. We also see systematic attacks on freedom of speech. So, and you see this in hate speech laws, again, to give the government the sort of power to decide what is hate speech is terrifying to me. I mean, I wouldn't ever fly the old flag of South Africa, for example, but to consider that hate speech because some people take offense to it, and to then criminalize those who do fly the old flag, to me is very much far outside the view of what a proper government should do. If someone has those sorts of views, let's say someone is racist or homophobic, or take your pick, for example, society can ostracize those people. They cannot do business with them. Yeah. They cannot engage with them. They can freely do that. That is not up to the government to decide that sort of thing.
Right. Well, you hit a real sore point for me, and that's the censorship side, because I think what the government is doing is it's sort of making examples of people who they single out who they say have put out fake news, and there are a couple of people who've been arrested based on that. And what that does is it stops people speaking their mind, because they're scared that
exactly.
they're going to be arrested as well, which is crazy, especially in a world where we have so much fake news. I mean, the mainstream media, they have their own narrative, and they will only push out the shit that they want to push out, and something terrible can happen, but if it doesn't fit the narrative, they just ignore it. And that's a compounding factor. Yeah, carry on.
I mean, you mentioned the point about democracy, but do we want a robust democracy where there is really a plurality of views, or do we only want those views that fit into our sort of view of things? Do we really respect the word and the concept of democracy in a fundamental way, or do we just think, as you say, certain sources of media say X is true and Y is false? Therefore, those who believe in Y can't say anything to the contrary. I mean, I don't know your particular views on climate change, for example, but there again, there seems to be this sort of narrative that if you have any different views on climate change and man's role in that or not, you're very quickly dismissed, and there's no real debate about it. With this coronavirus pandemic, those who have offered different views around the lockdowns, whether the virus is as bad as some say it is or not, they've very quickly been ostracized, and the lockdowns all around the world have fundamentally removed people's civil liberties almost overnight. So it's a very scary thing. There doesn't seem to be a questioning and pushing back of certain narratives anymore.
Right. Now we'll get to the current situation in South Africa in a moment when it comes to the lockdown, and there's so many other things I want to talk about in that area. But before I do, I had a live stream last night, and the co-presenter with me was Gerrit van der Merwe, who lives in China. And I asked him the question. I said, do you see what's happening in South Africa being mirrored from China? In other words, is China actually... Is South Africa becoming a mini China when it comes to the way that the country is going to be run? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the ruling government very much takes their cues from the Chinese government. I mean, again, to go back to their founding ideology, a lot of people sort of with the most control in the ANC, they, when the ANC was in exile, they got support in Soviet Russia, in Cuba, in China. So all those places, they were sort of steeped in that Marxist ideology. And I think now they very much look at the way China sort of conducts itself, its matters, in a very authoritarian way. And perhaps the South African government wishes it was similarly powerful, I think, in some ways. Also, when there's matters of international tension and discussion, so the South African government always seems to side with China or Cuba, or that sort of thing. Or even Venezuela. So we very much play into those sort of Soviet era Eastern Bloc, into that sort of way of thinking.
Yeah, what's scary about China is social credits and face recognition technology. That's just awful. Now, let's move on to the current situation. We're talking about, COVID-19 appears on the scene in South Africa in early March. And, of course, the government goes into panic stations and says it's going to fix the whole thing. And I find quite extraordinary the lockdown, because what the lockdown is doing is it's destroying the economy of South Africa, what's left of it. And the crazy thing is that I've got so many videos. I put one up today. It was actually a fellow who was driving around Isipingo, and there were literally thousands of Africans milling around as if it was just a normal day. This is in the middle of supposedly a lockdown, and clearly the social distancing is not working. And I'm just going to put an image up for people watching the video or watching the live stream to have a look at. And it's this iconic photo of a woman, a woman by herself, walking a dog in a Cape Town suburb, and she's apprehended by 7 police because she's breaking the law. And there are 3 police cars which actually were involved in this arrest. And then you look at a Sipingo, and today, where you've got literally thousands of Africans queuing up, no social distancing, and nothing is done about it. Isn't there something really wrong when it comes to the way this has been handled by the police?
Yeah, it's funny. The case of the woman walking her dog, you would think that all those police resources, they could be used for other things that are much more pressing. So the police don't seem to have their priorities right. And with the case of the informal settlements and people being so closely pressed together, I think for me, it's for many South Africans, we black and white in the middle classes, we have nice TVs, we have Wi-Fi, we have all this sort of stuff. We can still work from home. So for us, a month of lockdown isn't that bad. To expect someone in a township who has to share a tiny shack with 10 other people to stay in lockdown conditions, to me, is insane. A lot of people there, they're informal traders. They try and make a living day to day. They try and get food, that sort of thing. So we're applying very weird and different standards to different parts of the country. I don't think the lockdown, the way it's been applied, was ever going to work, really. It was almost unworkable from the start. I think it should have been a phased-in approach, maybe. There needs to be a recognition of the differences on the ground, kind of thing. You need to realize that there are different communities and people live differently, and you need to give them the freedom to decide for themselves how they're going to tackle these problems. We're also seeing lots of cases of abuse. I think there's even alleged one or two murders of South African citizens, black South Africans, by the army and by the police. And to think that this is happening after 1994, on the dawn of democracy, that we have the army deployed in the streets, to me is almost terrifying. How is there not more outrage about this? Why is this not being pushed back against? Why do we think that this sort of control is right for an army and for a government to have? Again, I go back to that fundamental question of individual freedom and responsibility. Government's role maybe is just to give people the information and then to hope and to educate them, in the best way possible, that they make the best decisions for themselves. And if they don't, then the consequences of that, will play themselves out. If they do make the right decisions, then they go along with their lives. So I think you're very right to point out some of the discrepancies in these things, and the priorities. You talk about some of the problems in South Africa, like gang warfare, that kind of thing, where there could be argued that maybe there should be a proper role for the state, that they then focus all their resources on a woman walking her dog in the street when there's no one else around. It seems to me to have their priorities very much skewed.
Right. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but Stanford University came out with a report this week, and what they stated in this report is that the actual fatalities from coronavirus are not 2 to 3%. There's something like 0.1 to 0.2%. And so instead of being 200 to 400 people dying if they get the coronavirus per 10,000 people, it's actually somewhere between 10 and 20, which is lower than the common flu, because it's the same people who are dying, normally very old with ailments and stuff like that, who would die if they've got the flu anyway. So the question is, why do we have a lockdown? Is it because they're just following China, just again mirroring China in South Africa? Because they've got a very different economy to countries like Australia, like as you were saying with the townships. We don't have townships in Australia where people live cheek and jowl, where you can't have social distancing. And as a result, in Australia, the actual coronavirus infection rate has just gone, it's crashed to just about zero. But in South Africa, where you've got a totally different form of community and the way they live, as you say, it's impossible for lockdown to work. So why destroy the economy with something that's just going to not work? Why not have that hugely high curve, as they call it, where everybody gets the virus, and a month later, all right, some people die, but they would have probably died anyway because of the social interaction that's going on in South Africa. But by putting in this lockdown, all you're doing is you're just killing the economy. What are your thoughts about whether there should have been a lockdown or not in South Africa?
Well, it's interesting. We see the sort of line being told that it's either the economy or people's health. And I think those two things are not diametrically opposed. People, your health is tied to your economic well-being, your ability to make a living, to get food, all that sort of stuff. So these two things should never have been seen as two opposing concepts or forces. We worry about the number of people that are going to die from COVID-19, and every life is precious, and of course we don't want people to die from it. But how many thousands of South Africans are going to die because of hunger and starvation, because of the lockdown, because they can't trade, because they can't make any sort of living for themselves? I think hopefully there will be a serious backlash. I was reading an article by Jeffrey Tucker from the American Institute for Economic Research on Twitter this evening, and he was talking about a backlash against all these sorts of narratives that have been peddled, about the mortality rate of COVID-19, all these sorts of things. So I really hope we see a backlash against that sort of thing, that people realize we shouldn't always listen to one or two experts on something just because they have, 5 letters after their names. Just because someone has many degrees, for example, doesn't mean that they're always right on everything. Just because someone is a president doesn't mean they're always correct on something. Just because someone occupies some position doesn't mean that we shouldn't question what narratives they're punting. And with something like a lockdown, an economic and societal lockdown, there should be a lot more debate around policies and what gets implemented. These lockdowns all around the world were imposed so quickly, and I mean, from governments from China to the US, everywhere, they've told different stories. They've changed their views on information. I mean, we know that the Chinese government suppressed information that contributed to the fastest spread of the virus. In the US, President Trump, he at first thought it wasn't a big deal. His main health advisor, Fauci, he also thought in February it wasn't such a big deal. And then a week or 2 weeks later, the narrative changed and all the lockdowns and travel bans were imposed. When you have this sort of complete stoppage of the world economy, there needs to be at least a little bit more engagement and debate between different people, between the citizens and their governments. It's to me almost a very scary example of how quickly governments all around the world think they can just make decisions for people's lives, that they can just control sort of how people can live, how they can operate, what they can and can't do. These arbitrary distinctions around essential and non-essential services. I mean, anyone's work is essential to them. Making a living is essential to many people. To think that the government can decide by some standard that something is essential and non-essential, to me is ridiculous, and that needs to be seriously questioned and pushed back again. So, yeah, I'll sort of go back to the start, I guess, with your question. Yeah, these lockdowns probably in their current form should never have happened. They could have happened in different forms, maybe certain industries. Maybe you can make the case for that, but to presume that you can shut down a country's entire economy, to me, is deeply immoral.
Right. Now, you mentioned in that response Dr. Fauci, who was one of the key advisors to Trump regarding this whole COVID-19 thing. And it's now come out in recent days that he is very closely tied to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And not only that, but the NHS actually sent about $4 million to the laboratory in Wuhan, which has been looked at as possibly where this virus started from. What I found very interesting is that until about a week ago, when this information started coming out, Dr. Fauci was at those daily briefings that Trump had with the media, but he's been missing in action. He hasn't been seen in those briefings for the last week. And I wonder if that's because Trump has just said, look, we don't want you here. Now, when it comes to this, the global impact of this lockdown, as you said, it's absolutely devastating, and some countries are not going to survive, or not going to economically survive, and I think South Africa is one of those countries. What are your thoughts about what happens when South Africa comes out the other side?
again, for me, it sort of goes back to policies and ideas. The sort of the dominant to me, and the importance of philosophy. The dominant ideas of the day dictate the direction in which a society goes. So if you see socialist and collectivist, fascist ideas being propagated by intellectuals in a society will probably go in that direction. If the society is more focused on individual freedom, economic growth, individual agency, maybe it'll go in that direction. I think that's, the philosophy that one holds about the world and the role of the individual in the state, that very much dictates your actions, and then again, what you think the role of the state should be, etc., etc. So, at the moment, the dominant ideology and the dominant idea in South Africa seems to be collectivism. We wait for the government to tell us what to do. We give the government a lot of control, and to me, as soon as you do that in any form, things will steadily go downhill. So post-COVID-19, South Africa has a great opportunity. Of course, if we followed the right ideas and the right policies, we could be open to the world and encourage tourism and drop affirmative action and expropriation without compensation and national health insurance, all these bad ideas. We can drop all of that and show the world South Africa is serious about economic growth now. We want to get that growth up again to 5%, 6%. I think at the moment it was between 1% and 2% before the coronavirus. I don't even know. It's probably negative growth. It will be now after the lockdown. So There's an opportunity, however slim, if we follow the right ideas. But I'm not necessarily that hopeful that we will follow the right ideas.
Right. Now, I just want to address the side chat and to the people watching. Billy, it's always lovely to have different points of view. Just make sure that you don't, or nobody in the side chat does things which antagonize other people. Otherwise, please, whatever your views are fine. Now, getting back to, okay, Dee's asked a question here. I just see this in the side chat. And please, guys, just put your questions in the side chat, and the moderators will cut and paste those to me later. And now, Dee's asked, Scott, ask Christo about his opinions on international NGOs and their impact on policies in South Africa. Now, I've got a live stream with Dan Ruitt on Monday night, where we're going to be talking about a whole lot of things related to this. But what are your views on that?
So I'm sure that I don't have intimate knowledge and sort of awareness of particular international NGOs, but I'm sure many of them try and influence countries in a particular direction. They have a lot of funding, and their funders want to see them implement their vision in different countries. So I'm sure that that sort of thing could very much be happening in South Africa. I can't think of any particular examples right now, but I mean, I'm sure that sort of thing is happening all over the world. And of course, different funding comes with different ideology. So, for example, the World Health Organization has a certain view of things that it might push. It comes with funding, and it might only give that funding to countries that follow a particular direction. So if you're going to take money from an NGO or a bigger organization, for example, the World Health Organization, you might have to be prepared as a country to follow in that sort of, what that organization demands from you. I think it's the same with the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. I think South Africa might well have to go to the IMF at some point for a bailout, for some sort of financial assistance, and that might come with certain restrictions that many on the left in South Africa don't particularly like, but which they might simply need to take at some point.
Yeah, well, apparently that 500 billion rand came from either the IMF or the World Bank. And
yes.
Once you start taking money from those organizations, they come in and they basically tell you how to run your country financially. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the first things they'll be doing is getting rid of about half of Eskom's staff, all those people who are in excess to demand. And I think Cassato is going to be jumping up and down like a rat on hot tiles.
That does excite me. I mean, I hope that happens, because I would quite enjoy seeing that happen.
Yeah, we'll wait and see what happens there.
Yes.
Now, is there anything else that you'd like to note about the situation under COVID-19? Anything philosophically when it comes to freedoms or what's going on, the army? Just tell us what you feel.
I'll go back to what I mentioned near the beginning when I talked about maybe my background in philosophy and that sort of thing, and Ayn Rand and what she wrote about, her view of the individual and individual agency and individual responsibility. I hope that the whole coronavirus pandemic all around the world just gives people some time to think about, should we really be giving governments this much power? Shouldn't we start taking back some of that power? Shouldn't we be more in control of our lives? For those people who want to be more self-sufficient and have their own communities and maybe secede, maybe there's an opportunity for them to do that sort of thing. I think just a fundamental point about government transparency and accountability. I mean, there can never be enough transparency and accountability, especially when governments have this much power over our lives. So hopefully this proves an opportunity for people to re-examine those sorts of deeper questions. It's always good to take stock of where you are, maybe yourself and your family. Maybe look at some things that you've taken for granted in the past. South Africa, I think it has one of the strictest lockdowns of anywhere in the world. We can't even... some people have been arrested in their own gardens when they've been sitting around drinking beer. That sort of thing, for example. So it's just ridiculous, the controls that have been imposed. So just take stock of where you are and whether that's the sort of place in which you want to live, and maybe think about how much control and power you've given to your government in the past, and whether that sort of thing should really continue into the future.
Right. Now, I've got another question from D, and he says, Scott, in a document from 2007, it states that China obtained 20% of the shares in Standard Bank, the same bank that is believed Cyril Ramaphosa is a major shareholder. Now, this is quite interesting because that 500 billion rand that was somehow picked up by the ANC, 40% of it, or 200 billion rand, was put aside to guarantee bank loans in South Africa. And of course, when you think that Ramaphosa is a major shareholder in a bank, isn't that kind of, padding his own bed?
No, of course, and again, it goes back to what you've touched on about corruption and having the right connections and that sort of thing. So, no, of course, it makes sense to think that there are all these different connections, and having one's fingers in many pies. Again, if proven true, it just exposes how politicians and parliamentarians and bureaucrats in South Africa, there's always it's almost like they'll only do the right thing if they can get some sort of monetary payout in the long run. They don't do it from a position of, I'm the servant of the people, let me try and make the best decision for the people's welfare. It's always it always goes back to to what can pad one's wallet in a way.
Right. I just want to address the side chat again. Billy, pull your head in a bit, buddy. Okay. Right. Let's continue here. Now let's move into a different area, which I think is something that you have a particular interest in, and that's expropriation without compensation. Now, clearly, that when you look at Moody's putting the rand to junk, you look at the lockdown and the damage that's doing to the economy. Isn't the ECW just like the final nail in the coffin for South Africa's economy, if they actually go ahead with that?
Yeah, there's a few of those nails, but I think the EWC is probably the biggest one. If you have a country a country in which property rights are not respected and not absolute, what reason does anyone have to invest in that country? What reason does anyone have to build a business, to try and employ people, to try and build a home for themselves and for their family, if the state can just come in at any point and take their property without compensation? And this isn't even just an attack sort of against the currently ruling government, the ANC. I wouldn't want any government to have this sort of power over people's property. Any government in the future, if we amend Section 25 of our Constitution, any government in the future will have the sort of power to take anyone's property without compensation. Why would you want to open that can of worms in any particular way? I mean, local investors, foreign investors, no one's going to want to invest in South Africa if expropriation without compensation becomes part of our constitution. It's almost crazy to think about, and it's also the wrong way to think about restitution of land. So we can go back. A lot of proponents for expropriation without compensation make the case that it has to be done to make right the wrongs of the past. I don't think doing away with anyone's property rights is going to fix the wrongs of the past. It is not going to in any way fix what was done in the past. To take away black people's property rights now in the modern South Africa, something that they've been fighting for centuries, to me makes a mockery of the struggle against apartheid. It makes a mockery of any fight for civil liberty and that kind of thing. So it's to me deeply ironic that anyone who thinks this might benefit those it's supposed to help in the long run, it's very much going to have the opposite effect. When you have a country where property rights are not respected, I don't know, a country like that definitely becomes a pariah in the world. I think investors and people like that will always go to countries where property rights are stronger, where economic freedom is stronger, that sort of thing. There will be, it seems maybe the government of South Africa is committed to implementing every single policy and every single step that's going to give people fewer and fewer reasons to live in and invest in the country. And again, they're sort of shooting the long-term they're shooting the long-term health and well-being of all South Africans in the foot by these policies.
Right. Now, I've been getting emails from a lot of farmers in South Africa, and they've basically said that if the government tries to expropriate their land without compensation, that's a bridge too far. They're going to go to war. They're literally going to go and defend their property. And I think that if the government starts doing that, you're going to have a huge outcry from the farmers, and I think they will support each other. And I think it could be take South Africa to the point where it could be very close to bringing the whole country down.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Any comments on that, though?
I mean, I think when you talk about something as serious as one's property and what one has built up over decades, you hit it at a very sensitive. You hit at a very sensitive part of who a person is and what a person is.
Right.
You're getting very close to what is very valuable to them. So, it's a serious powder keg, to put it that way, to even have this sort of discussion. And again, if you're really concerned about the long-term sustainability of the country, food security, that kind of thing, for all South Africans, why do away with productive farms and that kind of thing? It's very short-sighted. It's almost, one could argue it's definitely just for momentary political gain. The current government thinks in order to stay in power, it has to promise people that it's going to give them property and that kind of thing. It's never specified what property it might give one, So let's say it does the expropriation without compensation. It owns all the land in the country. It might give people little plots in the Karoo or something. What are they supposed to do with that? So it doesn't take into consideration those sorts of important discussions about what land is valuable, what is not, what it can be used for, what it can't be used for. There are so many examples of land that has been redistributed under the current constitution, that because people didn't receive proper state support, black farmers, those farms have fallen into disrepair. But there was no work done to support those farmers to do the right things, to have the right infrastructure, to have the right sort of support network. And I'm very sure that many farmers in South Africa want more farmers to come in. They don't care what race someone is. They just want to work with everyone. They want the best for the country, and they'll do that if they're encouraged to do so, not if they're threatened that their property might be taken away. It's very much the wrong way to go about the whole thing.
Right. Yeah, I think the ECW question is one that could be the turning point in a whole lot of areas. Now, when we talk about economic freedom, how can South Africa steer itself back onto the right course? What steps would they have to take?
One of the biggest ones was what you've already mentioned, Scott, was on BEE and affirmative action. For me, any proper conception of freedom is individual ownership and individual decision making, even if it's decisions people make that we don't agree with. I mean, do we only consider people free if they make the decisions that we ourselves agree with, that we think is the best for them, or do we truly value freedom in where people are going to make decisions for themselves? They might make very dumb decisions. I mean, I have the freedom to invest in different things. I might make the wrong investments, and then I have to live with the consequences. If I want to live a certain way of life, if I want to eat the wrong things, in the long run, that might be bad for my health. So that comes with freedom, these sorts of decisions, and you have to be open to those risks and know that people are sometimes going to make the wrong decisions. So going forward, in terms of economic freedom, we simply need to see a massive scaling back of the state. We need to see the scaling back of regulations and red tape, bureaucracy, that sort of thing. If you want to open a business, it needs to happen within 5 days. I think New Zealand might be the best example of how quickly you can get a license to open a new business. I can't remember the exact timeline, but it's from what I have read before, it's very fast. South Africa is very bad in that regard. There's so much red tape you have to work through, so many hoops you have to jump through before you begin any sort of business or entrepreneurial activity. All that sort of stuff needs to be scaled back. We need to very much put the state not at the center of people's lives. Individuals need to be at the center of their own lives. They need to have as much freedom to move, to choose, to interact with each other, to trade, all that sort of stuff. And if you have that shift in philosophy, that shift in thinking, I think South Africa could potentially unlock its potential. But again, I don't know how high the chances of that are.
Right. Now, I'm just going to address the side chat and those watching. Guys, if you want to put questions to Chris, please just, and Jaco, if you could just post any questions that people might have asked earlier that I've missed. And we'll certainly present those to Chris and see what he thinks. Now, while we're waiting for those to come through, socialism. Now, you think socialism is a pariah, and I totally get it. I totally agree with you. Isn't socialism kind of like a evil versus good type thing? Because the socialism model seems to be a very evil model, whereas where you have economic freedoms and you have a real democracy, it's strange. In America, you've got the Democratic Party, which are becoming more and more socialist by the day.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Then you got the Republican Party, which is like, I think, got the situation right, and I think Trump's doing a great job. But what do you think the greatest danger in South Africa is with socialism?
So I think in any country, and we can of course focus on South Africa, but any country where socialist ideas become prevalent, the state gains more power. So that gives the state more control to decide who the winners and losers are in society. For example, it could favor one race group over another group. It could favor one religious group over another group. It could favor one whatever group over another group, because it decides who the winners and losers are. So any society where you have that sort of increase in government control, to me, is going to go into the sort of authoritarian, tyrannical direction. To me, socialism is simply, philosophically, it's premised on the idea that the group or the state or the tribe is superior to the individual, to the wishes, the dreams, and the needs of the individual. It presumes that the individual's life is only worth anything if that individual's life is used in service to the state or to the group or to society. Whereas for me, from the economic freedom point of view, you need to place value in individual agency and individual freedom. We need to revert back to that sort of view of individual self-ownership, which is deeply empowering and has a lot of agency to it. It very much views anyone as capable of succeeding and failing, of course, but fundamentally it views people's lives as their own responsibility. Some people might need help, and that's up to society to decide whether they want to help them or not. That's not up to the government to, I'll use an example of a gun being held to one's head, because, a lot of arguments from the left, from a more socialist world, is that we need to care for each other. But to me, a government holding my head, a gun to my head, forcing me to care for someone else is not charity. It is not moral in any way. If there's no choice involved and no agency, there cannot be morality. And to me, socialism fundamentally removes any choice, any agency, any control, and therefore it can never be moral.
Right. Now, JJ Jacobs, yes, please just post your question again. I'm sorry I missed it. Now, we got a comment here which I think is really interesting, and we got a few questions as well. But let me give you the comment first. And Dee says, Scott, have you all noticed that no questions are allowed when Cyril Ramaphosa addresses South Africa, while the USA has daily messages from Trump and others, and of course they can cross-examine him? And he says, does this behavior show Cyril Ramaphosa may not speak or answer alone?
Yeah, I think it might be the president himself choosing that sort of view, or his national command council, that they've decided, well, there's simply not going to be scope for questions. So either that shows a lack of what's maybe self-confidence, robustness, that sort of thing, that you're willing to field questions and criticism. Maybe the president simply doesn't want to engage in that sort of thing. You would think, as the president of a country, you're a bit more open to feedback and discussion and that sort of thing. I mean, I know President Trump, he often goes after journalists who maybe are critiquing him and that sort of thing. But at the very least, there seems to be an open way for them to ask these questions. So he might not like them, but at least he is open to them. He might react in ways that sort of upset some people, but there seems to be an openness there. I think any president around the world, they, depending on their own view of their own importance and their own view of maybe their office and their sense of self, their sense of their view of themselves and their sense of self might be more fragile or not. So one would hope that a president allows at least some criticism and feedback. Yeah. And again, it goes to the thing in South Africa where the ruling party, I think in many ways, thinks of itself as above any criticism. It is sort of enlightened. It is not open to any sort of critique and that sort of thing. And then they simply won't offer those sorts of platforms.
Right. Okay, let's get to some of the questions. I've got one here. How many self-employed people with their own businesses do you think will be destroyed after the lockdown? And what impact will it have on the struggling economy?
Sure. I think thinking about the answer is going to make me even more depressed about the future of South Africa, but it's a very important question. In terms of numbers, I mean, we could probably look at up to millions. So as I mentioned, South Africa was really struggling before the lockdown, and now because of the fundamental destruction of economic activity, an economy isn't just like a light switch that you can switch on and off. It's a very complicated, interconnected organism with lots of moving parts. So to think that we're just going to restart things and get things back up and running is a very wrong view of viewing an economy. So it could take a very long time for South Africa to get back to any sort of good economic growth pattern where small businesses have the sort of room and capital and ability to grow again, to employ people. So that small businesses are the backbone of any economy, and this lockdown is very strongly hitting South Africa. I mean, especially the restaurant sector. You can't even do takeaways in the country, so it's nailing every small business at the moment. In terms of, as I mentioned, in terms of numbers, we could look at hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of small businesses that go under, and even with the government's solidarity fund and their help fund, which come with their own BEE requirements and affirmative action requirements, there simply isn't room there that the government can help every single business that needs that help.
Right. Now, Mikkel has asked, Scott, does Christo honestly think that the ANC will ever stand back and give power to the people and or release any form of power? What is his view on it?
Yeah, maybe that's the thing about self-delusion, as philosophers we like to overthink about things, and maybe we think, oh, maybe in this way there's hope, or in that way there's hope. I think the ANC, there's a few factions within the ANC, so maybe this is where my hope comes from. There is the reformist faction there is the faction that sees the current direction of the country as wrong. It sees the policies of the ANC as wrong. It thinks things need to be reformed in the right way, that South Africa needs to go in a different path. And then, of course, you have the more hardline faction in the ANC that simply wants to push things in a more socialist direction. You also just have those who are simply along for the ride. And Scott, as you've pointed out, they only want to be there because they've got the connections, and maybe that's how they're going to sort of improve their lives at the cost of others. They're going to leech off the state, you know.
Right.
There's no nice way to put it. So with the ANC as a whole collective and an organization, it depends which faction wins. So there are different scenarios, of course, and we might have to see which faction wins out at the end of the day. I know President Ramaphosa, you know, it's often said that he has to play between these different factions. He also has to deal with the trade unions and that sort of thing. Of course, I wish he would, you know, simply take the trade unions to task and put them in their place. But maybe he feels his position isn't strong enough to do that sort of thing. So to answer the question, maybe in a non-committal way, there are many directions in which the ANC can go, and maybe I'm engaging in self-delusion in that I think it might give up control at some point, but I can only hope.
Right. Now, Ray Redding has asked, Scott, does Christo honestly think the ANC will have... Oh, actually, sorry, that's the one that we've just asked you. Bikers SA, very interesting question. It's in 2 languages. So I'll just say it as it's written. Hukom is dasu baie army deployed.
Would you like me to answer in Afrikaans or in English?
English. But just for the record, what Bikers is saying, for those who don't speak Afrikaans, he's saying, how come so many people have been deployed in the army? Okay.
So I think there are maybe 2 answers to that one. Either the government is very worried about a breakdown in the social order, and they've deployed the army to ensure that if there is that big breakdown and sort of mass riots, the army is ready to go. And secondly, the army could have been deployed to help with sort of infrastructure work and that sort of thing, to distribute masks and gloves and that sort of thing. So you either have the very, I guess, nice and positive answer, and then you also have the authoritarian, very negative, very terrifying answer where the army could simply be deployed to quash and to destroy any sort of riots and that sort of thing. So I mean, there's a growing hunger in the country. People are becoming more desperate. We're seeing more looting. Again, to me, it goes back to that view that you can just impose a lockdown on all sectors of a country as diverse as South Africa and think people are just going to sit in their little shacks and not try and go out and make a living and try and find food. So we are seeing more rioting and looting and that sort of thing, and maybe the president has deployed the army to this extent because he's worried about what might happen long term.
Right. Okay. Now, I've got some more questions here. Kermit asks, when everyone says secession won't work without trying to make it work, how would you know that it won't work?
Yeah, exactly. By what standard do you measure whether secession has worked or not? Do you think it's successful when a secession movement has established its own country? Do you think a secession movement is successful when it's gotten recognition? Maybe when it has caused a certain number, maybe when it has caused a certain amount of trouble and enough people are talking about it? How do you measure success for a secession movement? The states in the US, you know, they were only successful when they managed to establish their own country away from Mother England, and that was after brutal war. So, I mean, then you also had the Civil War in the US when different states wanted to secede for different reasons. It's a complicated thing, secession, and I think each movement has its own measures of success. Whether I suppose my own view of whether they can be successful or not is just in terms of military might. I mean, centralized governments have a lot of military might, and I just don't know if any secession movements have that sort of, thing. I think at some point it shakes down to the number of guns you have versus the number of guns the other guy has, and are you willing to use that force to enforce your your view of what your community and society of the path they should follow or not. So it's a case by case basis to me.
Right. Okay. Now, JJ Jacobs, his question is in Afrikaans, which obviously you speak, so I'm going to give it to you in Afrikaans. But if you can respond in English and just tell people exactly what the question means before responding in English. And JJ says, As ek die boere nie hulle grond wil verkoop of sal verkoop nie, Christo, dan wat dan? Dan gaan EFF mos vat met geweld en dit gaan tot groot conflict lei.
Yeah, so the question, if the farmers don't want to give up their land voluntarily, surely at some point the EFF are just going to try and take it. I think, I think the questioner hits the nail on the head. The EFF views themselves as very socialist and also very militant, very fascist. They think violence is the way to solve things. So we might very well at some point see that sort of scenario play out. Unfortunately, I think if people, if their property and that sort of thing is that important to them, that valuable to them, then if they feel it's right to stand by it, then they very much should do so. And those, others are going to try and take it from them if they think that's what they should do. I, of course, hope that never happens. You don't want to see bloodshed and that kind of thing, but perhaps a part of me is, again, being too idealistic, and that simply is something that will happen inevitably when there's conflict between groups over such important things as land and property. So, yeah, I take the question and I say it could very well happen, unfortunately.
Right. Now, C. Hoffman says, do you think the ANC is still supported by the majority of the people? The citizens on the street see the ANC as the food basket. They don't have any idea of the GDP. And I think that's a very good question, because the average black person has no understanding of what's happening to the economy.
Yeah, I think, again, with South Africa's complexity and different communities and societies, people have their own, communities have their own challenges and things that they think needs to happen, that they think need the most attention. So when you have, I guess it's a roundabout way of answering it, but when you have the central government controlling everything in terms of education and information and that sort of thing, and as is the case in South Africa, they're obviously going to tell the narrative where they are the saviors, where they are the liberators, where they can do no wrong. They're going to try and convince people and educate them in such a way that they can never be questioned, that anything they do is never wrong. People's problems are only caused by other actors, and maybe foreign, maybe local actors who are trying to undo the glorious socialist revolution of the ANC. I see in polling and in elections the ANC support has been dropping consistently, and other parties, they aren't necessarily growing. So I think there's a general disillusionment with politics and politicians in South Africa, which I think is a good thing. I don't think politicians should have nearly as much celebrity status and power as they currently do in the world. It should almost never matter who exactly the president of a country is. He or she shouldn't have that much power that it matters what they do. They should have such little control over our lives that it doesn't matter if they're a Republican or a Democrat, or in South Africa, if they're ANC or EFF or DA, they should be so non-important that people just go about their lives and try and do their own thing. Nowadays, politicians are way too much they're almost like new celebrities, which I think is concerning, because we place that much importance on them and that much value in what they say. So I think, again, to go back to my own personal philosophy and view of people, I think each individual in South Africa needs to decide for him or herself who he or she votes for, what is important to them. I think it's important to keep in mind that, while certain people, certain classes or races might have voted for particular parties in the past, that people don't vote as sort of collectives, as only part of a block. They vote as individuals. They make their own decisions. So perhaps there is scope to try and engage with people, to try and influence them in a certain direction. I don't think freedom, in and of itself, economic freedom, is the purview of one particular race group or economic group or anything like that, religious group. I think freedom, the right ideas, can work anywhere in the world, and they have indeed, especially in some of the Asian countries. We see where they've gone more the freedom route. They've done a lot better. So I think freedom is the birthright of every person in the world, and hopefully through the decay of the ANC, through their own ineptitude, a lot of people in South Africa will start to question the role of the state, and they'll hopefully start to see that they should take back control for themselves and for their own communities.
Right. Okay, another question from Kobus Hoffman. He says, Christo, do you think the ANC are still supported by the majority of the people? The citizens on the street see the ANC as a food basket. They don't have any idea of the GDP. I think we just asked that question, haven't we?
Yeah, we touched on that.
Yeah,
one,
okay, yeah. Sorry, I forgot to delete that one. Let me just get rid of that one.
No worries.
Okay, another question here from D. If the ANC implodes, do you foresee all their voters supporting EFF?
I think a lot of them will go in that direction, but I think others will also try and find another home. I hope that a lot of people are getting tired of the sort of racist rhetoric of the EFF. The EFF is very much based, as I mentioned, on socialism and fascism, violence, racism as well. They think it's always one race group versus another. I'm sure that they want to be in control of the state. They want an even bigger state. In South Africa, they want to be in control of every single aspect of people's lives. So I really hope that people don't go in that direction. But, you know, in times of economic hardship, we saw it in the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany. People were desperate, and they were looking for a leader. They were looking for someone who could promise to lead them out, to give them food and jobs and prosperity and all that sort of stuff, and they went along with what he promised. I think when you have times of desperation, populist movements such as the EFF become more popular, and there's a danger that people go in that direction, which of course I hope doesn't happen, but it might well happen. So I guess it depends on the other political parties and how good they are at their messaging. For example, the Democratic Alliance, if they become more consistent, if they sell individual liberty and freedom as the right thing for South Africa, as the birthright of South Africans, then hopefully they can get a lot of support if they sort of portray their message in the right way. So yeah, if the ANC implodes, I'm sure that people who voted for them will go in all sorts of different directions, and a lot of them will go to the EFF, but hopefully a lot of them go to other parties as well. Maybe we even see some new, some new centre ANC come out of the sort of ashes and realizes that its previous form was completely flawed, that it pushed South Africa in the wrong direction. So I suppose that's all we can hope for.
Right. Okay, I've got 2 questions left to go. Guys, I'm going to be shutting down the questions shortly. So if you've got questions, please put them in now. I've got a question from Mikkel and 2 questions from Gordon. Mikkel asks, Scott, what does Christo think about the final result is on this current path? And let's be honest, past predicts future. What is the likely result for South Africa as a country and a people?
I think the likely result, the more than 50% result, is a more authoritarian, autocratic society, that we go in the direction maybe of Zimbabwe. We see a general decline in, even more of a decline in economic growth and prosperity. We see more people leaving the country. We see people trying to get work in other places around the world. We see the people who live in the country, their own wealth and that sort of thing will keep on declining. I think that's probably the most likely scenario, just because I think that the current government is committed to its socialist ideology, and then there's a sliver of hope in me that thinks, people sort of realize that this is not the right path in which to go, and that they start to push things in another direction. I'm not saying that any particular party is the right direction for South Africa. I think all political parties are flawed in one way or another. I mean, the nature of politics is compromise, so you're always going to compromise on your principles if you're in the field of politics. So no political party is perfect in that regard, and we also shouldn't expect that any political party is going to lead South Africa out of the way. We should very much take control back into ourselves and think that it is our responsibility to push things in the direction in which we want to go for ourselves and for our communities.
Right. Okay, now I've got one final question for you, and it's from Gordon Blues, and he says 2 questions. So we actually got 2 questions here. Firstly, does Christo see EFF beating ANC at elections, and when? And the second question is, how much electoral fraud is there in South Africa?
I think I'll go with the second question. And again, I gave this with a caveat that I haven't sort of done any particular studying on it. This is just my impression from reading different reports and that sort of thing, but I haven't done in-depth research. Just in terms of fraud in elections, I don't think it afflicts South Africa as badly as it does other countries. We're, despite all our problems, our courts are still very strong. Our media, even though they're very much left, at least they try and push back against politicians. They try and ask questions. Of course, they have their own narrative, but it seems that our media is still quite robust and strong, and they try and hold politicians accountable. And then the Independent Electoral Commission, the IEC, who administer elections, they also seem to still be impartial and independent, that they they don't favor one party over another. Of course, every election there are examples of vote rigging and fraud and that sort of thing. We see it especially in provinces where the Democratic Alliance might be doing a bit better. There seems to be a bit of stuff going on in the background where people, where votes for them are sort of gotten rid of or not. They have questioned it every now and then, but there hasn't been a full-blown scandal as such. So either that means that the scandal itself was hidden very well, or it means that there wasn't a scandal. I guess it depends how, if you're the person who has glass half full or glass half empty, how optimistic you want to be or not. So in terms of voter fraud and that kind of thing, I don't think it's as big a problem as it might well be, which is good, of course, and interesting. That might not be the case. And then just on the first question, if I think the EFF can ever beat the ANC, I mean, stranger things have happened. They have been growing. They have been getting support. I do think that people are getting tired of how militant they are, of how racist they are, and to me that's obviously a good sign about South Africa in general, that people are getting tired of the sort of narrative that they punt. They're very destructionist. They don't really give a view of what could happen if they governed, for example. They just have all these fanciful plans about expropriation without compensation and massive government spending and all these sorts of airy-fairy ideas which would never work in implementation. So there's an opportunity for parties such as the Democratic Alliance to show what happens when they govern, when they're in charge. For example, in the Western Cape, which one can argue is the most well-run province in South Africa, what an actual political party with goals and accountability can do as compared to the EFF. I don't think they'll ever beat the ANC in an election unless the ANC keeps on going the route of scandals and corruption, which of course they can do. I mean, that can always happen. So a lot of it depends on what the other political parties do. I don't think the EFF itself has that sort of clout and that popularity to beat anyone. But if the other parties keep on making the mistakes they've made in the past, perhaps the EFF can indeed win. If not, the national election, maybe they can win some provincial elections at some point down the line.
Right. Now, Michelle makes a very interesting comment. She says, when I saw the history that they were teaching my kids at school, I was shocked. Now, clearly history has been rewritten for the kids. Now, the reason I'm raising this is because the EFF are clearly targeting students to join their party. I mean, you've got the universities where they have these EFF groups walking around now, and it's clear that they're targeting the younger people. These are the people who've been indoctrinated with the false, fake ANC form of South Africa's history. Doesn't that kind of play into the hands of the EFF?
Yeah, I think it very much does, and it goes back to the point of state control and state influence. That saying that history is written by the victors. Those who win sort of struggle movements, liberation movements, and indeed elections, when they gain this sort of power where all education is centralized under the state, they can tell a narrative that suits them. And to me, one thing that maybe gives me hope for South Africa and the rest of the world is at least the spread of information around the world. People have access to all sorts of different sources of information on the internet, so they can question what their governments tell them. Whether they do so or not to a sufficient extent is, of course, another matter. I hope they do that more in the future. But no, I very much agree that governments, and states, they can tell their own narratives, and the EFF, I'm sure they've seen an opportunity to tap into a narrative that suits them, narrative of race versus race, of violence, of exploitation, of class struggle, all these old school Cold War Marxist ways of thinking that pits people against each other. At the end of the day, I mean, it's easier to conquer a divided nation than it is to conquer a united nation. So that can very much play into their view of governing one day, where they simply think, the more they try and divide people and pit people against each other, the bigger the chances that they might win at some point. So, for as much as I personally, and I'm sure a lot of us disagree with the EFF, their philosophy, their that sort of thing, we maybe in some way you have to give them credit for the gaps that they've seen and how strategic they have been. I mean, it's terrifying to think in a way as well that they're this sort of savvy and clever, but they've definitely seen a gap, and I think they're trying to exploit every gap that they can find.
Right. Now, I've got one final question. It's from Mary Duplessis. And she says, please ask Christo whether we should worry about what Mboweni said tonight about a central government body being established to identify and reallocate underutilized farmland.
Yeah, again, as soon as any government representative says we're going to do X, you should sort of sit back and say, hold on, but what exactly is going on in the background here? I think it might have been Ronald Reagan who said the most terrifying words in the English language are, "Hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help." We should be very wary of. I mean, that came from a president of the U.S. and obviously he was a very good president and he saw the proper role of the state. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. So I think a lot of us have placed hope in Tito Mboweni, the finance minister. We've thought that maybe he's the one who, in government and in the ANC, he sort of has some realism about him. He sees that things can't continue the way they are. But again, it just shows you how committed I think most people within the ANC are to the socialist view of things, that they think it's up to the state to give people land, to redistribute things, to control people's lives. So it is concerning to me, those sorts of comments. I haven't read that particular one tonight. I guess I was tired from all of President Ramaphosa's speeches. I was still looking at the memes of him trying to put on his mask. So I didn't watch Minister Mboweni's speech tonight, so I'm not sure exactly in what context he spoke. But no, as soon as anyone in government says we're going to try and do this thing or that thing, you should very much sit up and take notice and interrogate why they said it and in what context and what might be behind it.
Right. Okay, well, look, I just want to first off thank you so much, Chris. It's been a very interesting discussion. Your input is...
No, I have to thank you for the opportunity. It's a great pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great to hear what your views are on things. If you want to share this video, if you've got a web page or a Facebook page or something like that, I'll send you the link in a short while. You're welcome to throw that into your channels. I just want to thank the moderators. Lovely to see you guys here. You do a fantastic job as always. And for those who've joined us tonight, thank you for being part of the live stream and posing your questions to Chris. I'm going to be shutting down the live stream now. Please take care, guys. Have a good evening, and don't forget tomorrow night, that's Saturday night, we're having a really fun evening. We're going to have Winston, the musician, on, and we're going to have Patrick on as well. I'm hoping Darby will join us as well. We're going to be celebrating the successful food drop that was organized by Farmers Aid South Africa and Patrick over the last few days, and just enjoying a light-hearted evening with Winston playing some of his great songs. All right, guys, so please take care, and I'm going to close off the live stream now.